Hi everybody, happy Thursday. Today's story again is part 3 of the Twits. I'm loving this story so much. Did you make some predictions yesterday about what tricks Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit might be playing on each other? Yeah, good. Well, today's chapter is called The Wormy Spaghetti. So let's see what happens in this chapter. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin, and she carried them back into the house, hidden under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on Mr. Twit's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "I think my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful off her own plate, which of course had no worms in it. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating again, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his spiky beard. "I don't like this. It's not as good as the ones we had before," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's far too squishy." "I think it's very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I think it's a bit bitter too," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a very bitter flavour to it. Make sure you buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plate. Then she said, "Do you want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with his hand. "Why then?" he said. "Do you want to know why it was so bitter?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. Look at Mr. Twit's face. Not sure he's going to let that go. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought of a really nasty trick. One night, when Mrs. Twit was asleep, he crept out of his bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his workshop. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a 1-pence piece, onto the bottom of her walking stick. I wonder what that's going to do. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't even notice. Well, what's the point of doing that then? The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added little bits of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it ever so neatly, so the extra bits looked like they were part of the old walking stick. Oh, I think I worked it out. Have you worked it out? Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was starting to get longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice that it's happening. You yourself, for example, right now, are growing. You're growing a bit taller. Every day that goes by, you get a little bit taller. But you don't notice it because it's happening so slowly. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual but she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when she was having to hold it up here. That stick's too long for you, Mr. Twit said one day. Oh my goodness, so it is, Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't quite work out what it was. There's something wrong, all right, Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. Well, I wonder what could have happened, said Mrs. Twit, staring at her walking stick. It must have grown longer. Don't be a fool, Mr. Twit said. How can a walking stick grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood doesn't grow. Well, what's happened then? Cried Mrs. Twit. It's not the stick, it's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning. It's you. You're getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now. That's not true, cried Mrs. Twit. You're shrinking, woman, said Mr. Twit. No, it's not possible. It jolly well is, said Mr. Twit. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days. Never, she cried. Of course you have. Take a look at your walking stick, you old goat. Look how much you've shrunk. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks. Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. Have a look what's happened to her chair. You work out what Mr. Twit's been doing, as well as sticking bits of wood onto the walking stick. I think we'll find out tomorrow. Well, I hope you enjoyed that part of the story. The wiggly worms were a bit gross, weren't they? Okay, right, I'll be back tomorrow with another part of the Twits. Have a great day home learning. Keep it up. You're doing some great work. The children that I've seen send in their work, so keep it up. And I'll be back tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.